talk here in just a minute, so if you want to get up and like throw your plate away or get a little food or coffee or something like that, so you're not moving around so much, do that in the next minute or two. So.
Oh yeah, I gotta grab my stuff. It's over there.
Alright, so last time you were here, you talked about what again?
What specifically Oriental?
Like why we're not in communion, basically,
Yeah, why we're not in
and like
communion.
what went down. I took it until about like the late 6th century.
Okay, and
Stopping at Severus of
and
Antioch.
and today you're gonna focus on.
I'm gonna pick up basically where I left off, talk about some key figures that, and like
And you're
just
gonna bring it and end with like today with sort of like what's.
yeah, and then I'm gonna just get real and just be like, here's what the problems are and all the things that I see in my life and yeah, all that. So.
I don't want you to feel insulted if I get up and go. I'm up against time.
You're totally fine.
Okay.
It's so yeah. It's I will not be insulted. I understand. All right. Yeah, we'll wait on the cameraman. I'm trying to see if there's a.
I'll give you a little intro right now, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
I see what you mean.
See if you can find the plug over there.
Last time when Stefan was here, he talked about the Oriental and Orthodox churches, also called the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian churches. Most people, when they look at them, they think
You're fine, you're fine.
Orthodox are actually not in communion, so the non-Chalcedonians, and that word
Probably, like, over here.
Chalcedon, which was in 451.
Yep.
Okay, so that's good. Remembering dates for ecumenical council. That's a seminary education not fading. So
Let's just hope
they
it doesn't
rejected
die.
that council, and so that sort of like after that point there was this divergence historically, and so the non-Chalcedonian churches are like the Coptic church in Egypt. Okay, it was non-Chalcedonian. The Ethiopians. There's the Malankara Orthodox, which are in India, the Indian Orthodox churches there, and then there's also the Syriac Orthodox. So you have like, yeah, and the Armenians. Okay, so if you see churches like those, I mean, if you go into that, I mean, we've been separated from them in communion longer than say we have with the Roman Catholics, but you go into those churches, it feels more like an Orthodox church than it would if you went to a Catholic church. So there's a lot more culturally and in terms of ethos that's similar between them. And so Stefan talked about kind of like how that separation happened, what the arguments were, and things like that, and how they're how we're different and alike. So he's just to pick up with that and bring us to sort of modern day where the work that's been done to sort of try to remedy that schism. And if there's any sort of like major historical schism in the church that has the possibility of being healed, it's like this one could be rectified in our lifetime possibly, which is pretty historically. Usually that doesn't happen. Usually schisms that are hundreds of years long don't ever get fixed.
Get worse.
Yeah. So this one actually is making progress the other direction, which is pretty remarkable. So he's going to bring us up to that and talk about what that is and where the real differences actually, lie and stuff like that. So it's you're interested in history and even sort of modern day differences and stuff. It's pretty fascinating.
Is there a marker I can use?
Yeah.
So yeah, hi, I'm Stefan. I go to St. Vladimir Seminary. Some of you may have been at my talk back in the fall, which this is the sequel to. Others may have caught my talk back in February of 2017 when I talked about liturgical rites. And I've been here a few other times too, just because I can. So as Father Matthew said, I'm going to pick up where I left off last time. I do want to see like maybe how many of you were here back in the fall when I gave that talk. Okay, so 3, 4. Okay.
So you had to kind of like do a synopsis of other stuff?
Well, I think Father Matthew actually did a pretty good
Yeah,
job
pretty good. All right.
about what went down. I just wanted to be like more.
Tell them real briefly
Specific.
just go
About
over
Christology.
what was the main
main
theological like issues
Yeah.
real quick so they have that in their mind.
Yeah, so basically, the Council of Chalcedon, which for us is the Fourth Ecumenical Council, says that Christ is in two natures, and the Oriental Orthodox would say that Christ is from two natures. And so the word that they use is mia physis, which means one nature, but within that one nature, it's the full humanity and the full divinity of Christ. It's not mixed, it's not confused, it's just united. And so for us, we would say he's in two natures, fully human, fully divine, no mixture, no separation, no confusion, etc., etc. So we're basically saying the same thing, we're just emphasizing a different part of that. So I talked about last time, like, the council itself and some of the fallout that occurred afterward, when the disagreements started to take place, and then when we really start to see separate patriarchates, because it wasn't until about the mid to late 500s that we start seeing how there's a distinct Coptic church and a patriarchate of Alexandria that is Chalcedonian, and same thing in the Middle East where you have a Syriac church of Antioch and you also have a Chalcedonian one. Yeah,
sorry, so just to understand a little better, so the non-Chalcedonian churches that rejected the council, they were not buying into the unity of the divine and the human. They were sort of looking at the human and the divine as being separate within Christ, a little like the Arians.
Other way around. They were emphasizing the unity of Christ. And not that we weren't, but they felt that the way that we worded the council left room for the heresy of
separation.
of separation, which we had just dealt with at the last council. So they were thinking not this
Which
again.
was with Arianism, right? The previous
No, that was the first council.
Okay.
First council had to do with whether Christ was God. The second council was whether the Holy Spirit was God.
Right.
Then the third council was, okay, so Christ is man and he's God, but they're separate. And a more radical position would say it was two persons. So the third one condemned that. Then the fourth one dealt with a heresy that said that he was only a divine being, that there was no humanity in him. And so that is a heresy that they also agree with is wrong. But when they didn't accept the council, we felt like, well, if you don't accept this council, you obviously hold to that other heresy. And so that's where a lot of the problems started.
Got it. And what's the name of the heresy?
Eutychianism?
Yeah, it can be Eutychianism or monophysitism, which is not the same as miaphysitism.
So it's like a more mystical, right? Like emphasizing the unity, which is a more Oriental, mystical vision of all mixed up together, right?
Sure, but except that, they wouldn't say it's mixed up though. It's just it's united into one nature. But it's one incarnate nature. So it's sort of like how there's a soul and there's a body, but we're one, but there's not a sharp distinction between our soul and body, even though they are still very much their own thing. It's the same thing like that.
So there's kind of a spectrum when you think about this, because once you say, okay, he's God and he's man, then you have to say, well, how?
Right.
And so there's sort of a spectrum, over time that people argued over. And on one end, you have sort of the heretic Eutyches and monophysitism, which is emphasizes union really highly. And when you really emphasize union, you end up emphasizing the divinity over it's so unified that the humanity gets swallowed up in the divinity and gets minimized. And the other end, you have a much bigger separation between the two, so they're distinct. So how distinct are you going to keep the two nature or the two aspects of Christ? And when they're really distinct, you have the other end where it's there's two separate persons. There's Jesus the man, and then there's Logos the God, and he comes down and possesses him. And then, which that language sounds really weird to most Christians because that's not the way we talk about.
Right?
Yeah, well, actually, that was adoptionism and other stuff like that. But
yeah, there's a similarity between those two. But yeah, if you were going to say he was exclusively human and that's it, that would be Arianism.
Arianism, right.
Although, it's a little more complicated than
he's
that.
divine, just not as divine, but yeah.
Right. Yeah, because Arius technically said that he thought he was divine, but it wasn't the way it was meant, the way that the church taught. So, yeah.
So this is sort of what happened historically is they sort of said, okay, it cut off the extremes, sort of, right?
Right.
It said if you go to any of these extremes, sort of emphasizing union or emphasizing kind of distinctness, you end up going into bad territory. So it sort of set some boundaries there. And so this is one of those boundary lines that they're arguing over with the Miaphysites or with the non-Chalcedonians
Yes.
is one of these sort of how do you emphasize it? and is one group crossing a line and how they emphasize it that makes it unhelpful.
Yeah.
And was it, obviously there's a content issue here that you're describing, but was it really just disagreement on those content issues, or were there political, geographical, sort of tribal almost concerns as well driving those
Absolutely,
differences?
there definitely were. The Council of Chalcedon was it was definitely pushed by a lot of emperors, and so that's where a lot of the non-Chalcedonians started to refer to the churches of Chalcedon as Melkites, which means those that are loyal to the emperor. So yeah, I mean there definitely was this kind of like political shift that was going on, and you know, it was a semantical, but it was also, I think, a philosophical issue too. And there was like, already there was bad blood that was going on with different sides, because like Dioscorus, who I mentioned, who was refusing to accept the council, and then he was pushed out, not for heresy, but for disobedience. There had already been an issue with him, where some people that he had sent to arrest someone else ended up like murdering him, and so they blamed him for that. So there was all this kind of like stuff that was going on that were already attached to the intensity of like the people involved. So yeah, I mean, it certainly was not just a theological issue that was kind of motivating all of this, and that's also why it took the schism, I think, over 100 years to actually like be a thing, because people were trying to like reconcile and rectify and kind of figure things out. But I think as time
And how
passed
many
on,
100 years was there attempts made to heal the schism?
Oh,
How long did that go on for?
and you can technically say it's still going on now.
Yeah.
But so we have our sixth ecumenical council. Six.
That was the last big attempt, right?
Yeah, that was 681, I believe. And
so 200, 250 years somewhere?
yeah, like, so I mean, we were still trying to kind of make things work. But even after that, you still have interactions and things like that, which is what I'm gonna focus my my presentation on today. So we have a buddy of mine who's a member of the Coptic Church who goes to St. Vladimir's with me, so he can. I'll call on him at some point. I'll make sure that I'm.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
Just really big picture, why is it actually that the Christian churches have tended to sort of splinter like that, pretty distinct, well-defined groupings, whereas the Judaism has sort of been defined in a much more amorphous kind of general disagreement. Everybody has their own little interpretation. And there's groups too, but generally there's just more open debate, and everybody's a little different, but it's more a scattergraph. Is that a fair description?
I think with most world religions, other than Christianity, you will see a lot of what you explained. There are like groups that are very kind of distinct, and even though they're in the same like religious category, they may be more ambiguous, or as you said, amorphous. But I don't think it was always that way. I mean, certainly in Judaism, like there are like strict forms of Judaism who, like, if you're not their specific sect, you're not considered a Jew at all. Like they just consider you like goyim, right? Like the Gentiles. So.
But I think what would be different, and I'm not sure absolutely, but like very specific and narrow problems in Christianity will cause very large rifts. And I don't know if that happens. Like, for example, like with Arianism and Orthodoxy, it was like arguing over like a word.
Yeah.
Like a single word, you know? Like, you know, actually one letter, homoousios or homoiousios, right? Whether there's an iota in that word or not was like the crux of a lot of. So, yeah, I don't know, but that is something. I think Christianity is much more philosophically concerned. And it seems that way with the language and the stuff like that. Just with like saying stuff in the exact right way,
Yeah.
and making sure your metaphysics is right or not, and just being really concerned with it being rational and making sense and just really holding the line to that. It seems that there's and I don't think we appreciate how philosophical the early Christian church was. I mean, it fully inherited a whole Greco-Roman philosophical concern, and just sort of people would argue with philosophy all the time. So I don't know. That could be part of it too.
Dan?
Part of it may also be specifically to your question about like why Judaism versus Christianity. So even up until Hellenization, part of Jewish tradition is to provide interpretation, right? So which is why, like you see in the Gospels, Jesus or St. Paul, when they cite the Old Testament, they'll cite it, but differently, right? Because part of the understanding is to provide new and greater understanding. But especially early Judaism, much more so than really we see in its modern forms, is much more concerned with what you do, rather than necessarily what you believe, right? Like the whole Old Testament, the Israelites still know that God is the God of Israel. But they don't live that way, right? Like every prophet comes and says, you offer sacrifices and it's abhorrent to me, or you don't offer sacrifices, right? So you either are totally disobeying the law, or you're fulfilling the law but failing then to actually, embody, and you're still oppressing, your brothers, right? And so the questions that the prophets will ask is, like, is this the same family that I brought out of Egypt, that I made into my chosen people, and so on, right? And so Judaism, especially in its earlier forms, was much more concerned with this covenanted community and participation in that covenant, not necessarily in the more mental aspects, although that was always very well prized within Judaism.
That's sort of the Greek element, right? This desire, precision of thought and kind of
Partially, I think Judaism had this a lot. Right?
Well, and I also think in Christianity we have a much clearer way of defining who our groups are, because we say we're in communion with them. Like, what does that mean? That means they can take communion in our church, we can take communion in their church. We can con-celebrate. Our clergy can get together and do the services. That kind of concept, it doesn't really exist outside of Christianity. I mean, obviously there's no Eucharist. I mean, there's like Eucharist type things, perhaps you could say, but there's not kind of like this central, like, this is what unites us. And I think that's kind of one of the I guess, like, the driving forces, because if other groups had that sort of thing, you might see sharper distinctions. And certainly in versions of Christianity now that don't have a Eucharistic or sacramental belief system or any kind of liturgy, they are more kind of ambiguous and amorphous and more like the non-Christian religions that you see. How they're just a little bit more fluid with membership and doctrine and everything else like that.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of it too is being part of the Roman Empire, where the Roman Empire had a very sort of structured and clear notion of polity, and the church integrated itself into that political structure. I mean, our word for diocese, that's a Roman word for a political subdivision. Parish is the same way. So like these words, so our conceptions of ourselves is a very sort of political conception based on the empire, that we were the Roman Empire. So I wonder if that has part of it too, that we are able to really sort of say, I think that makes a difference. I don't know how integrated other religions were in comparison the way Christianity was with the Roman Empire. It was so intertwined. It was like the dual head of the state, it was like another political structure. So. Yeah.
Was there ever one Orthodox church like with Constantinople, and when did a fracture occur to become like national Orthodox churches?
So in terms of the situation that we have, it's not really so much a fracture. Like if you're just talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church.
I'm talking about the Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church.
Right. So
churches are becoming more nationally identified.
Yeah. So those aren't like fractures per se, because I'm a member of the Antiochian Archdiocese, and I can come here and go see a parish.
But prior to the quote national churches, you had Constantinople. Now, what happened to the power of Constantinople to allow the rise of national churches?
Well, Constantinople wasn't the first one, though. You had Rome, you had Antioch, you had Alexandria. Those were the patriarchates. And Constantinople was actually one of the later ones that was elevated. and then Jerusalem was made a patriarchate. So you had like the main five. Most of the national churches we see now are essentially daughter churches of Constantinople that grew large enough and had the need for their own patriarch and no longer had to be like dependent on Constantinople or no longer wanted to be. I mean, like the Russian Orthodox Church, I think, is one of the largest ones in the world. So they obviously aren't going to be like subordinate.
But those all happened post-fall, right? Post-fall of Constantinople. Like after Constantinople fell, you started seeing these.
No, because the Church of Cyprus has been autocephalous since the Third Council.
Yeah. What about Georgia?
Georgia has been autocephalized and then like it was taken back and then re-autocephalized.
But the rest of them, like Serbia, Romania, Moscow, Poland, all those are.
Serbia was I think it was after the first fall of Constantinople when the Latins invaded.
Oh yeah.
But not after the second fall when the Turks.
It happened later.
Yeah.
That's the short answer to your question. It happened later. Maybe, I mean, the first sort of 1,000 years, really, you didn't see a lot of these other national churches popping up too much. Because they were based on ethnicities, really.
Right. Well, sort of.
That was because, sorry to interrupt, because when they went to convert people, they wanted to do it in their dialect. So that's where the national identity came about. I think.
Yeah, well, and the Church of
Whereas
Bulgaria.
the Latin, they just forced them, whereas the Western church forced them just to do the liturgy or whatever in Latin.
Yeah, much later though. The Church of Bulgaria, like for example, started to like get autocephaly, I think in the 9th century. And then they lost it too, and then it was like granted again, like later on. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say that it's all like a more modern thing, because you do see the seeds of it, but certainly the way we have national churches now. I mean, the Church of Poland is autocephalous, Church of the Czech lands in Slovakia, and even here, even though they're not like autocephalous, you still have groups like the Carpatho-Russians and the Ukrainians who like have their own dioceses, but they're under the Patriarch of Constantinople. So I definitely think that the rise of nationalism has shaped a lot of like the polity and even maybe the modern ecclesiology of like what we experience, especially like outside of the homelands. And I'm actually writing my thesis on overlapping jurisdictions, so maybe in the fall I can come back and talk about that. But again, I wouldn't say it's fair to say that it's a division per se, because it's like, I can go to all the churches I just mentioned and serve in the altar and take.
No, I wasn't saying it was division theologically. I was saying division geographically and power structure.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Because something had to have been weakened in the power structure.
But the Oriental Orthodox have the same thing. I mean, in 1993, because of the civil war with Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Eritrean church was granted autocephaly. And I mean, to most people, Eritrea is a small sliver that's right next to Ethiopia. But they had a need, and certainly I think it helped a lot of people not die for them to be an autocephalous church.
I can definitely say that now compared to say back in ancient times, there's definitely a much clearer notion now where people are like, oh, we have our own country, we should have our own church too.
Yeah.
That is definitely that sort of very clear idea is, it's definitely much more contemporary and has grown over time.
Sure.
Whereas back in the day it was you didn't see that as much, that idea that oh, we're Christians living in the Scythian lands and we need to have our own church with our own language, our own people. You just didn't see that as much.
Yeah, I mean the ancient patriarchates that I mentioned, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem are all they're named after a main city in an area, and they're not based on nationality or any kind of borders. They're just, if you're in this vicinity, that's the patriarchate that you're under. So, yeah.
I thought that was also one of the traditions of the Roman Empire of Orient, that it was a lot more federal almost, rather than the very strict structure of that. I mean, that was my sort of understanding. So from the beginning, whereas in the West, in the Roman Empire, there was kind of this very strict subordination, and church was a hierarchy. And I thought that they're already in the Byzantine Empire, they were kind of all, it's not that they were autocephalous, but they were kind of just a little bit more independent, and maybe that's one of the reasons that actually allowed for the Roman Empire for the Oriental Empire in Constantinople to survive and to endure for so much longer than the Western Empire, because there was more opportunity for people to feel part of their region and also part of the common empire, whereas the Western Empire was much more, and the autonomy of the church was a lot greater. I think the trust of the role of each priest in each parish to know what's right and to take the right decisions, versus in the Western church it was always just interpreting the decisions of the Pope, which we didn't have. The notion was, every priest knows what's right. Yeah.
So
I thought that was my understanding of the cultural differences between Constantinople and Rome. But
That's certainly one of
better.
them. Yeah, that is certainly one of them for sure. And our brothers in the non-Chalcedonian or Oriental Orthodox churches, they've, because of the fact that they weren't favored by the empire, a lot of their particular churches were kind of like their own thing, but still in union with each other. So, they saw this before we did. You have the Armenian church was like very distinct. The Syriac and the Coptic churches are also very distinct. Whereas like these churches of Constantinople and Serbia, they were culturally very much the same, and they were kind of like, they traded ideas with each other, and they're all kind of daughters of the Byzantine Empire in that sense.
So this might be a question that maybe you could answer is, like today, comparatively, right? Like our different churches that we're all in communion, all the different Orthodox churches, we get together and do stuff and see each other and visit. And how much interaction is there among the different Oriental Orthodox churches? Because my sense is that they're a lot more off doing their own things.
Yeah.
In comparison to the Byzantine Orthodox.
Yeah. Part of it is, in general, you're definitely right. I think also that some of that has to do with the fact that, pre-coming to America, everybody was kind of off in their country doing their own thing, and we celebrate different liturgies, right? Different liturgical rites entirely, and so maybe liturgically that kind of introduces some things. There are here in the diaspora, some regions have greater interaction than others, obviously. And I think part of that might still be that we're still very new to America. For example, among the Copts, the earliest people that have been here are maybe just pushing 60 years now. And with other groups, others have been here for longer than each other. But yeah, I definitely think that we've always remained in communion, but the level of interaction wasn't necessarily always as great. Jerusalem, I think, sees probably the most interaction. Shocker. But yeah, it's definitely not the same level. We were never necessarily connected in the same way that the empire was all connected.
And some of the cultures are pretty different too, like Armenia, Ethiopia, Egypt. There's a lot of different languages and cultures and experiences going on that aren't shared, right?
In this part of the country, like New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, I feel like you see a lot more interaction with the Orientals because there's like an intentional, they do like a pan-Orthodox liturgy at least once a year where they invite the clergy from all the local Oriental churches to come and celebrate. But like Dan said, they have 4 distinct liturgical rites, so it's not like for us we can just kind of hop in the altar and kind of just know what's going on. There may be a few things that are different, but you can kind of like stumble along. But with them, it's like, okay, I need to look at the text. You need to tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do because my rite is different. And that's not a bad thing. Obviously, if you were at the talk I gave last year, I'm a proponent of liturgical diversity. So, but I do think having the same rite is, I guess, like a modern convenience that we have in the Eastern Orthodox Church for sure. So, with the handful of exception of our Western rite churches. So.
All right.
Okay. So, all right. Well. So. from, like I said, it was like the late 6th century you actually started seeing the divisions solidify. And you know, it's interesting because even after that, the way to receive each other into each other's churches was by the distribution of the Eucharist. Even there's a text called the Spiritual Meadow by St. John Moscos, which is very much against the Oriental Orthodox. There's some horrifying stories in there, but through all that, the way to receive each other into each other's communions is just to approach the chalice. There's not even a statement of faith. There's no chrismation. There's certainly not rebaptizing. It's just a matter of come on over but stay here. And there's not many. I don't really know of any other groups that's ever been the case with. So I feel like that's kind of like the Spirit is guiding us in spite of the fact that there is a real split that is going on. And even though, like, at this point, I mean, the tensions are very high, these people don't like each other, there's still the sense of like, okay, well, for you to be reconciled to the church, however they perceive that, is, you just come and receive. Later on, they got stricter with the Council of Trullo in 692. They said, okay, non-Chalcedonians are to be received by statement of faith. So you read off like these things. You basically say like, do you anathematize this? Yes. Do you anathematize this? And then after they affirm that, you might do like a public absolution or something. But then they're in the church. And what's interesting, I should have asked for a great book of needs, but in the great book of needs for the reception of a non-Chalcedonian, it asks them if they anathematize the heresy of Eutyches. And if you paid attention, the answer to that is yes. So why are we asking them a question of something that they already do in their own church? So I think that kind of shows like the level of misunderstanding that took place. The fact that there's a heretic that they anathematize like we do, and yet we're like making sure that they do.
Excuse me, so what was the heresy of Eutyches?
That the divinity of Christ swallowed up his humanity. So his humanity basically wasn't even a real thing.
That's what we're talking about. That sort of.
Yeah. So Saint John of Damascus, who's like in the early 8th century or so, he's known for like writing the defensive icons and things like that. He says, the non-Chalcedonians, other than not accepting the council, and he does, he does call them heretics and things like that. But he says, like, other than that, like, they are Orthodox in every single other way. And you just don't see that kind of language being used about other groups.
Yeah, I think the word heretic sometimes, I think we gotta be careful because the way we understand and hear that word today is not often how it's being used or understood in the past. If we hear heretic, we think like, counter-reformation, I'm gonna go around like the Spanish Inquisition and get heretics, you know what I mean? Like that's what we have in mind,
Yeah.
In heretic, it just means, in some, on these, the usage, you look at the text, it just means error,
Right.
It's just like, oh yeah, these people are in error, they made some mistakes. And you say it like that, and it sounds all soft and gentle. You say heretic, and it makes it sound like you want to chop their heads off or something, right?
Right.
I mean, so
yeah.
like, how do you use the words and what they mean? So like, I think that's just helpful to understand because the way we hear it, the way John Damascus is using it is probably different.
Absolutely. It's also interesting because there are certain saints that are held in common, like even kind of afterward. Saint Isaac of Syria is actually one of them. He's in the diptychs of the Syriac liturgy. They go through a bunch of names and they mention him. And I asked, like, one of the seminarians that's in the Indian or Malankara church, which does the Syriac liturgy, I was like, who is that Isaac? And he's like, Isaac of Nineveh, Isaac the Syrian. And I was like, you mean the same one that we have? He's like, yeah. And I'm thinking like, okay, this is well over 100 years after, or 200 years after like the final split. So how did that happen? So it's interesting that even some of the boundaries in certain areas still might not have been very clear. The fact that you still will occasionally find a saint in common, like way later. And then in like about the 12th century, from the Oriental side of things, you see, no problem. You see these people that are like more willing to dialogue. So you have the Armenian Catholicos, what we would consider a patriarch, Saint Nerses, who the Armenian seminary that we work with is actually named after. He was basically ready to sign an agreement that was like, yeah, like Chalcedon's fine. I don't even really know why we didn't accept it in the first place. Like let's get this done. And he said that, if you say one nature and you're understanding that to mean that there's a unity, that there's no mixture or anything like that, and if you're saying two natures, but you understand that there's not a separation or division, like you're both within the orbit of orthodoxy. So, unfortunately, there was a war that broke out that stopped that union from taking place. So
No, but this is really good because this just shows you sort of the real character of like trying to achieve union, right? Like other crap's always getting in the way, right? Wars and or just petty jealousies or something, or language miscommunications, and this stuff's always getting in the way. And then like they're just not quite sure. Do we really mean the same thing or do we not? It's like it's like you have a old boyfriend or girlfriend, and they say they love you. You're like, I don't know. They keep doing stuff that makes me think they don't. And, no, but it's kind of like that. I mean, that's the way human relationships are. I just think it's.
So I mean, a lot of it is like very unfortunate, like external things keep stopping all the attempts of like real reconciliation that could have or would have taken shape. There's also Saint Gregory the Hebrew, who is a Syriac figure whose family was Jewish and then converted into the Syriac Orthodox Church, and he was the bishop of Persia, like for the Syriac church, and so he would write things, and he knew like Nestorian heretics, and he knew like the Chalcedonians, and he said, I don't find a single difference among us and the Chalcedonians other than our choice of wording. And so it's not like this is a new idea, that somehow in the 21st century we all got smarter and just decided, all right, let's just forego everything. It's like there's already been people on both sides, like through the years, that have like, somewhat cautiously looked on the other side and was like, oh, you're not so bad, but there's still a schism, And then getting more into the modern day, you've got like the Russian missionary things in Africa, that were going on, and you had Bishop Porfiry Uspensky, who he traveled to like Jerusalem, and he started kind of like the Russian ecclesiastical mission there that was supposed to be kind of like a counter to the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre, and he traveled to Africa, and he met with Coptic and Armenian and Syriac hierarchs and clergy, and he basically said like, they're not wrong. Like he literally was just like, they're not heretics, they are correct in their theology and their Christology, and you can observe their liturgical rites and learn everything that they believe, and it's perfectly orthodox. And then really, like way in the modern day, Archbishop Dimitri of Dallas, who only died a couple years ago, and he was very much like a proponent of like the Oriental Orthodox are Orthodox. He let the local Ethiopians there use the altar at the cathedral, which is like a big deal. Before they had their own house of worship. He was unapologetic about the fact that he considered them Orthodox, and he was so loved by the local Oriental Orthodox people and clergy in the Dallas area that at his funeral you had like the Malankara and the Copts and the Ethiopians all came, and they sang their own songs for him like after the official funeral was done, like around his body. And he was found to be incorrupt, so I'm just saying like that, carries some weight.
He's a cool figure. So there's a famous photo of the signing of the surrender on one of the U.S. aircraft carriers with the Japanese, the Japanese general, and then General MacArthur, and they're sitting there, and in between them is Bishop Dimitri, 17 years old.
What?
Oh, yeah.
Right, or 18. He's 18, yeah. And he was an official translator. So he was like a polyglot. He just like knew like 15 languages fluently. He was really smart. So he grew up Baptist when he converted when he was like 20 to the Orthodox faith or something like that. So there's a famous picture. He's sitting there, and he was there at the surrender, and he was translating for it.
Yeah, so there you go. That's another,
Yeah, so he's something else. So he's
the real deal. Yeah. So
what did you say he was what? He was anti-corrupt?
Incorrupt.
Incorrupt.
What
So
is that?
they dug his body back up and it hadn't decayed.
And like we're talking Texas heat. Like,
Several
and
years
he was not
later.
involved. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Why did they dig it back up? Did they just want to sort of show?
No, so he wanted to be buried at the cathedral, but for like legal reasons, they couldn't accomplish that right.
I don't think it was
right away.
completed yet. The cathedral wasn't fully constructed.
Well, the cathedral was, but where, like, so now there is, when you walk into the narthex at the OCA Cathedral in Dallas, if you go to the right, there's a chapel. So that chapel was built later for Ladika to be buried there. And so that's why they did that. They were building the chapel for him so that he could be at the cathedral. And so that's why they dug him up, was to, like, you know, transfer his body.
It was years later after he died. So
It was at least 5 years. So, but I mean, it's common in general in Orthodoxy when bodies get dug up for various reasons. Usually it's the transfer of the body to somewhere else that, you know, you would take a look at the body. And that's how, I mean, they figured out that like St. John of San Francisco was incorrupt and all these other saints that we have.
yeah, it's supposed to be, I mean, the symbolism behind it is like it's supposed to be a sign of sort of the resurrection, sort of like the incorruptibility or something like that. That
Right.
like, one's own holiness or closest to God somehow has this like, you know, like you get further away from death the closer you get to God.
Right, yeah, and that's the whole point, is because, you know, we teach that death isn't like natural, you know, it's not supposed to be a thing that we experience. So, yeah. So basically, I mean, that's like most of the general kind of bulk of things. I mean, I could get into like agreed statements that were made and like list of people who said this and that, but really, I mean, all that you can find online.
Could you just talk briefly about some of the theological consultations that happened in the 60s and 70s?
Sure, so
And
there
sort
was
of,
a
that really
lot-
kind of brought us closer to where we are
I have a
now.
book actually, I forgot about this. This is a book that actually has all of this that you can take a look at. It's by Christine Chaliot, who has visited our seminary many times, and she is a force to be reckoned with. This lady is on fire for this cause. It's very impressive. So she has been a part of, I think she's been a witness to some of the consultations. And so you have like various things that were going on throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But really, the bulk of it was you had like they met in Geneva in 1990, and then there was Chambazé in like 1993. And those are the two like agreed statements that kind of are the ones that most people reference. That basically say, you know, we're both Orthodox, we hold the one holy and Catholic and Apostolic faith, you know, despite the separation, and it just acknowledges everything I talked about today and also last time about the whole like Christology issue and how like we both agree that like Eutyches is a heretic, we both believe that like Theodore of Mopsuestia is a heretic, you know, and all these things, you know. That's really how you bond, is you just agree on who you don't like. That's the best way. One of the problems though was after the agreed statements were sent out, they were supposed to like be read by all the synods of the churches on both sides, okay? Because you're not just gonna like act without like the people that you're meeting with. I'm pretty sure that there were representatives of every autocephalous church in both the Eastern and the Oriental churches there. I might be wrong about that. But I'm pretty sure there was at least like one or a few people representing each church. But when they went back to the synods, like the row of hierarchs that are appointed to be the Holy Synod for each of the churches, that's when people started to like not agree and be like, I don't know if we can really accept this. Some were like, I don't think there's been enough research on this. So the only synods who completely signed off were the Coptic Church and then our Patriarchate of Alexandria. So they both agreed. The Syriac Church and our Patriarchate of Antioch also agreed, and so they signed off on it. And then the Indian Church on their side and the Romanian Church on our side, actually, all their whole synod signed off. But even after the synod signed off of these churches, some of the other bishops who weren't on the synod or some of the other people involved, like the clergy, were like having, you know, like doubts and second thoughts. So it's not an easy thing to just kind of snap your fingers and be like, all right, like we've always agreed. So let's just be done with it, even though that might be.
So what do you think are some of the psychological reasons why people are so reticent to sort of accept this stuff, or find excuses, or sort of get cold feet and don't want to do it? Like,
well, I think as we discussed when I was here last time, I think as you phrased it, it's an ecclesiology we haven't dealt with. To say that, like, we're the one true church, oh, and so are you. Like, what? Like, that's just very strange. That's very foreign to both of our concepts of, like, what the church is. And rightfully, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of certain elements of modern ecumenism certainly make me uncomfortable. And so I feel like some people think, like, well, if you move the line this way, then you're going to have to compromise on so many other things. So that's
do you
why
think it's some reactionism maybe? Like, because some people are gone so far with ecumenism where they're like, let's just agree and all hold hands and sing a song and there's no difference. Well, you know, like not a, there's no, like a, it's an unserious sort of attempt at union without dealing with the problems, and so people sort of think everything is like that, right?
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely that way. But I mean, I think objectively, when you look at what's gone on with the Eastern and Oriental consultations versus what goes on with other groups, I mean, it's very different. But I also feel like some of the people involved in the dialogues will also go and then dialogue with other groups too, and seem to kind of lean a similar way. And I feel like that kind of holds things back. Like, in my opinion, and this is not like necessarily the official opinion of the seminary or anything like that, but just in my opinion, we need to focus on each other. Like, yeah, we can talk to other groups too, but if we really think that, like, we're both Orthodox and that something can be accomplished, we need to, like, focus our energy on, like, dealing with our issues with each other, because then we can have, like, a united Orthodox witness, and then people will take us more seriously, because they see that there's, like, two groups both claiming Orthodoxy, and then, oh yeah, I mean, we kind of validate each other, but, you know, not really, or sort of. I mean, you know, that's not good. And then other groups are like, well, why can't you include us in this? Or why can't we say this was a misunderstanding? Or why can't we say this was a language issue? So, I definitely think that more progress could be made if we just kind of zeroed in on each other. It was Patriarch Athenagoras, who is known for, like, lifting the anathemas against Rome and things like that. Shortly before all that took place, he told some of the Oriental Orthodox hierarchs, he said, I want us back in full communion at the end of this year. Now, it didn't happen, but I think partially is because he got distracted. You know, he wanted to talk with the Roman Church and everything, which, again, is not something that I'm against, but it kind of, like, took his attention away from the Oriental Orthodox issue. So,
Do you think some of it is apathy? Like, people don't really care or value sort of, like, union as much or that much for various reasons. Maybe like, well, we all agree, so that's good enough. We don't actually have to do the work of institutionally or any sort of organizational way of doing it.
right.
You know, or just like, there's too many other bigger problems, right? And just not caring about it.
And honestly, I have mixed feelings about this issue. Like, so it was brought up last time that in certain parts of the world, there's been agreements signed that Eastern and Oriental Orthodox can take communion at each other's churches. And, like, part of me is like, oh, cool, that's a step in the right direction. We're, like, healing the schism. The other part of me is like, well, that's kind of scandalous, because if you go to an area where those agreements are not in place, it can be very hurtful to be like, well, they let me take it over there, but I can't take it over here. Or sometimes one side is, like, allowing it, but the other is not reciprocating, you know, and all this stuff happens. So if you have people that are in, like, the Middle East where it's allowed, they think, oh, there's no problem. I mean, we're back in union. Like what's left there to do?
Yeah. So talk a little bit about how there is partial communion in Egypt and in Syria.
Okay.
Between the two communions.
Sure.
And why that is, and kind of how much intercommunion there is there.
So,
officially,
as I said before about the agreements, the agreed statements from 1993, when they were sent back to the synods of the churches, I said that both the Patriarchates of Alexandria and both the Patriarchates of Antioch agreed. So because of that, in Egypt, you know, the Coptic Pope and our Pope of Alexandria were like, okay, we will allow people to intercommune, we will allow people to intermarry, like, so they didn't have to leave their church if they got married. They could just get married in the other church and like it was fine. Antioch, you know, with the Syriac church and the Patriarchate of Antioch, that one's very like that one's really intense because you can pick godparents from the other church, and they discourage you from ever switching. Like if you're Syriac, like you stay Syriac. Like okay, you marry someone who is what we would call Antiochian, but like you're still part of your church, they're still part of theirs because we're trying to like say that we're the same. And they there's a lot of they technically don't celebrate liturgy, but they come very close to it. I mean, there's like services where you see you know, both of the patriarchs that are in that area, I mean, both standing together, like, and some of them are allowed in the altar, even though they're not serving, or they sit in places of honor that, like, you would only put, you know, like, your own hierarchs in, and things like that. But also the problem is that does not always trickle down. So, my understanding is that, like, in the Archdiocese of Nigeria, where, if anyone was here for when my friend Loveday spoke, he's part of the Patriarchate of Alexandria, the Eastern Orthodox. They don't allow intercommuning in that archdiocese, even though both of the primates of the patriarchates have said it's fine. It's just not done there. Whereas, like in other nations, it is. But then you also have the Ethiopian church that's in Africa, because like for us, our Patriarchate of Alexandria is over all of Africa. So if you rule something effectively, you know, it covers that whole ground. But just because the Coptic Church agrees to something does not mean that the Ethiopians will. So there's that issue.
It seems like the churches that are more connected in life with each other, right? Like in Egypt, the Coptics and the Greeks who are there in Alexandria, like, I mean, one, they face a common enemy, right, which is Islam. So they're both persecuted together. So there's nothing like a common struggle to kind of bring people together. And the other thing is they live amongst each other, right? They actually know each other. So this is something I've noticed is the less contact an Orthodox church or an Oriental church has with other Christians from that other communion, the more likely they are to take a hard stance and be like, there shouldn't be any communion, we're not alike, we're different, they're heretics. Mm-hmm. So the more ignorance there is, the more sort of lack of charity or interest in union there is. You know? Yeah. And I think that is a human characteristic. I think that's all the time, right? Like if you live amongst a certain people, right, you know, who's different, you're more likely to sort of not be afraid of them or understand them a little bit, you know. Whereas if you don't have any experience with a certain kind of person who's different, whatever, you know, their background, then you're like more likely to be more cautious or afraid or sort of have sort of wrong ideas about it. So I think that's just, I think you see that all over the place, but I think it plays out amongst us. Yeah. So places where they're all intertwined and tight, they're ready to make it happen, you know. So
yeah. Well, and I'm also sometimes surprised at certain like parts. Like I was just reading actually this morning, just kind of brushing up on things, that apparently in Bulgaria there's no official agreement, but like there kind of is a little bit of intercommuning that occurs, especially like with the Armenians and the Bulgarians. So sometimes people just don't want to sign agreements; they just want to kind of do it. And even like here in America, you know, I know sometimes, like especially if there's someone who's Oriental Orthodox, they're in an area where the only option is an Eastern Orthodox church, they can get a blessing to receive in our churches as long as like our hierarchs or that hierarch is okay with it. And I guess in theory the reverse could be true, but I also don't know if that is really helpful, because like I said, like you go back to another area and like there's no intercommuning, and it's like it's scandalous to people. And I've witnessed people take advantage of the situation and really abuse it, where they were going back and forth when they really weren't supposed to. So, and I think that's something that we really need to think about, because like, I mean, if that's like, you know, the body and blood of Christ, we don't just want to hand it out to anybody. I mean, that's not what we, you know, what we do in our church. I mean, that's like, I mean, effectively, if this was any other group, it would be kind of like an adulterous affair. That's like saying, well, I'm out of town, my wife's not around, I'm gonna shack up with someone else. Like that's not how we treat that. You know what I mean? But the people making these agreements aren't thinking of it that way. They're not thinking of them as an other body. They're thinking of them as this is the same church that unfortunately got fractured somehow. So like I'm not accusing the hierarchs who made these agreements of having like bad ecclesiology. I'm just saying that like we don't always think about the implications of what we do.
And so the downside would be people would be like, well, we don't need any more official agreements or do this officially because we're already
Right.
just doing it. We're already intercommuting, so it's fine, right?
Yeah.
So it stops
Exactly.
you short. You sort of abort the process before it fully gets
Right.
completed.
Right. And any dialogue with any other church that either of us have had has stated no intercommuning until we're actually back in union. But then with us, we've just, in certain areas, as we've said, it's already started to occur. That's why for me, it's both heartwarming and it's both kind of concerning at the same time. Because obviously we see that there's a difference, we see that there's a special bond, between the two communions of churches. But then at the same time, it's like, is jumping the gun on it really helping it? So, but, you should do whatever your bishop tells you to, like ultimately, so. Yeah.
What are the core issues in the Oriental churches that keep them maintaining communion, even though they all accept they're non-Chalcedon? So what are the other issues that keep them separate?
They keep them separate from us?
No, from each other.
There's nothing.
There's nothing?
They're in full union.
Every one of them.
Yeah,
Okay,
the only thing that we were saying is that concelebration is hard because they don't do the same rites.
Right.
But that's not an example of not being in union. That's just.
So they're not like technically theologically or sacramentally ununified, but maybe more just sort of like practically, I guess, is a way to say it. Just sort of like they just don't do a lot of stuff together, as much. I mean, maybe more so here, but it just, partly because of the language and cultural and historical differences that are so much more wide between them, but also the liturgical. That definitely has got to be a barrier,
I mean, I know people, including this young man, who I have witnessed, serving in the altar of a liturgical rite that's not his own. I mean, he's served in Syriac and Indian churches before. And, I know several either altar servers, but also like deacons, clergy of the various Oriental churches that have concelebrated with the other rites. But it's like a little more like you kind of have to pay more attention to what's going on so that you know what to do. And I mean, I guess you can speak to that. Like when you served at the Syriac or the Indian church, like were you like given a book to follow along with, or were you just kind of told what to do at certain points? Or
Yeah, I mean, I followed along, especially when you look at things like liturgy. We were talking about this earlier, but liturgy, it's specifically liturgy, because there's so many unifying themes within liturgical rites across the board, really. So that part kind of helps. But yeah, if you have a book to follow along, it's awesome. If not, then it's more difficult. It's not so much kind of like Stefan was saying earlier. Like realistically, the Russian application of the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom and maybe the Antiochian or the Greek application of St. John Chrysostom is almost identical. Though that's one liturgical rite and it's one celebration.
I can jump into a 100% Greek liturgy and probably like 99% of the time just keep right up with it and do what I need to do. If I didn't know language at all, because the movements and actions and words.
Right. There's some minor variations that you might need a heads up on that you'll probably get as soon as they happen. But I mean it's the same rite.
And potentially, a regular parishioner can go to a Greek church or something, and not necessarily need a book, because familiar with the actions and everything. But in another rite, it is a different rite. In the same way that if I were to go to an all Latin like Tridentine Mass, I might recognize portions, but it's like this is its own thing. Okay, I need just somebody have a book or a hymnal or something I could follow along with.
Right. Yeah, and I experienced that. I got to serve at an Orthodox Western Rite church during Bright Week, and I was just trying to pay very close attention to everything because it's like I'm trained in the Byzantine Rite, like I know that one, I can just do it. But this one, it's like okay, and of course I've read the text and I know stuff about the Western Rite, but when you're actually serving it, it's different, you know, because I had to like undo a lot of like the things that I've been trained to do because it's not the same rite.
Yeah, there's like a muscle memory that you learn with the liturgy, even if you don't even like. It's almost like you don't even know. You couldn't even like say where you are, but you would just know what to do and say next. I mean,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
a lot.
Yeah, with like very little heads up. You're just like, oh, okay, I see. I see where we are. But like when I served at the Western Rite liturgy, they went over like everything I was gonna do beforehand.
Mhm.
It's just like, and if like I, you know, and I knew like the cues I had to look out for, and you know, so it's the same thing, you know, when the Orientals celebrate, you know, they do things like that. But you know, I definitely don't think that liturgical variety is a hindrance to unity. I mean, I think I've said that before, but I just really like to emphasize that because it's easy to be like, oh, well, they look so different from us, so obviously they, you know, they're heretics, right? But it's not that simple.
Do you think that in among the non-Chalcedonians, like, are they more likely to express and think of their identity like, oh, I'm Armenian, or you know, and I'm Coptic, and whereas like among a lot of the Byzantine Orthodox, they're more likely to say, well, I'm Orthodox, you know, I'm Eastern Orthodox. Do you think that's a distinction you can make where we're a little bit more likely to identify as a whole group, right, of Orthodox, whereas they're more likely to identify with their particular church and not think of themselves as much as like, well, I'm non-Chalcedonian Orthodox or something, or I'm Oriental Orthodox. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're really the only one that can answer that. I mean, I've observed
That's
it, but
interesting. Yeah.
I would
It's
say
just a matter of where they're, on what level they're placing their identity, right? It's like,
sure.
do I think, is my identity as a New Jerseyan or is it as an American, right? You know, so it's like, where is that, where am I placing the kind of locus of my, a primary locus of my identity?
I think probably the ones who would be most eager, so to speak, to say that like, oh, well, I'm Oriental Orthodox would probably be like the Syrians or the Malankara. Maybe because I feel like they're the ones who kind of talk about Oriental Orthodoxy the most, maybe, or maybe the Armenians.
Well, see, but then I've met people who have told me that they've met Armenians who refuse to call themselves Orthodox because they just want to be Armenian.
Right, because they're Armenians.
I've never come across that myself.
Yeah,
but I've heard that. I'm like, okay.
You might be right. I mean, that element is there, but I think that, especially in the modern understanding, and really realistically, I can really only speak to the Coptic experience, but a lot of Copts don't even necessarily know about I mean, I myself didn't know about other Oriental churches until my late teenage years, which, you know, sounds bad, but that's something that I think almost all of us Orthodox, especially here in the States, you know, face. It's very funny. I grew up in New Hampshire, and we drove 3 hours to Boston for liturgy on Sundays, and now looking at Google Maps, it's like, you know, there was a Greek church maybe like 30 minutes from where I live. There's an OCA church kind of nearby, but we just, it's not like we refused to go. We just didn't know that there were other Orthodox people, you know.
Sure, but like in that case, it was.
Which is funny too, because I'm from two Oriental, you know, families.
Right. Yeah, because he's half Eritrean, so his dad's Eritrean.
Yeah,
his
no, my mom's a
Coptic.
Coptic, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have even seen sometimes in cases where there's someone who's Oriental Orthodox, there's like 2 Oriental parishes in the town, but it's not theirs, they will go to the Greek church or the OCA parish. And I'm like, I mean, yes, of course, welcome, but that's interesting. Why would you not want to go there?
Yeah.
So now some people, like when I've asked them, some of them are just like, I don't care that we're technically not in union. Sometimes it's you use English. That's actually a huge thing.
That's a big thing.
At times, there's been people who totally switch who they're in union with.
You know, no, that makes sense, because if it's like, well, I know my liturgical or my cultural language, maybe you say you're Malankara, you're Orthodox. Okay, I know the stuff there. But this next one over here is a Coptic church. I don't know Arabic.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'll just go to the one that does English. I'll go to this like Greek church where it's
If
half
both
English,
ones
half
are
Greek.
different rites,
Yeah.
and one of them
Either way, it's
more
a different
English,
rite.
might as well just
Exactly.
learn
Yeah,
one I understand.
Now, did you have any Chalcedonians ever coming and showing up at the Coptic church to commune or be a part of it? Just because
Yeah, it's really funny. I'm from
Like they accidentally stumbled in and didn't know, or
Oh,
I don't
well,
know,
and
or
accidental
they meant
stumbles,
to, or-
no. Yeah, it's very funny because I'm from Pittsburgh, the holy city, where almost every jurisdiction is represented. And we don't have that much interaction, partially because of where we are. I guess Chalcedonians do come to Oriental churches with some frequency, obviously, depending on where you are.
Because it seems like right here, like almost every church
Yeah,
that's Chalcedonian has non-Chalcedonians in it.
yeah. Well,
Like,
that's yeah.
like we have two here.
Right.
You know, we have a guy who's Mount Cara, goes to Montclair, and then there's Emmanuel, who's Ethiopian. You know,
Yeah.
so like it.
We don't have as many, I think. I mean this is a totally different topic, but I think a lot of that probably has to do with like colonization and Arabs and I don't know about Armenians, but Arabs, Africans, oftentimes I think have a shame of being, and this even you see in Antiochian Archdiocese sometimes. That's a totally different topic, but there is a little bit of a shame of our own identity and maybe a feeling of, oh well, we're probably backwards, and we're probably more backwards than the Europeans, and there isn't an understanding also sometimes of the theological depth that exists throughout the world. Not just in Egypt, but in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, and all these things. I mean, so many people know of, St. Nikolai of Życia, right? Not maybe as many people have read the writings of Pope Cyril VI, who was a very recent Coptic patriarch.
Who's a saint now.
Who is a saint now,
Kirill.
yeah, saint. So I think that might have something to do with it. That's not the topic of this conversation. But you're definitely right that almost no matter where I go throughout the States even, it's like, oh, well, we've got an Eritrean family here, we've got an Ethiopian family, we've got some Armenians who come to this church. And I don't know what that is.
Yeah, because I don't think you see that as often.
The reverse.
The reverse.
Not at all.
Yeah, I know one example, and this is a more extreme one, in Louisville. This is not in Kentucky. It's not the case anymore because the Ethiopian population got large enough to build their own church. But this is a pretty large Antiochian church. They had maybe like 1,000 people or something in the church. There were like 200 Ethiopians.
Yeah, they had a sizable population.
Like huge. I mean, not like a couple, like 200 Ethiopian ones were all part of this one Antiochian Orthodox church. And so that was very interesting because some of their customs started creeping in to the larger community. Like when you have that large of a group like that, and so and the priests would start doing like some of their stuff and customs and stuff for them. Very little small stuff that they did. So I mean,
well, that priest was also very open to non-Chalcedonians. Part of that is the Antiochian Archdiocese policy. He was very insistent on English. So I think maybe I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe not on as large of a scale, but I've definitely been to Eastern Orthodox churches who like refuse to use English, and like things like that. And I've come across Eastern Orthodox who don't realize that they're in communion with the other churches either. Like even at like an OCF retreat I was at in college, this one guy who was Greek was like, I can take communion in your church, right? Like as if he just figured this out. And I was like, yeah.
He's figuring out as he's saying it to you.
Yeah. And I'm just like, yeah, dude, it's like Antiochian, like that's actually called the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch. So if you had any doubts, it's still like within your ballpark. But yes, you can commune at like a Russian church too, and like, things like that. And he's like, whoa. And to be fair, I mean, we do have like rogue groups apparently who break off and still keep the same name and things like that. Like, there's like Ukrainian churches we are in union with, and then there's one we're like definitely not in union with. And they both have churches here. So I mean, you do have to be careful and kind of like make sure you know like who's under who. But I mean, I don't know, just live life, man. Like it's not that hard to figure out.
So anyone else have any more questions for Stefan on that topic?
Or for Dan on his life.
My favorite Coptic writer is Matthew the Poor.
Father Matthew the Poor.
Yeah. He died what, like 20 years ago? I don't know, maybe not that long.
It was like in the early 2000s.
Oh, that's okay.
Maybe like ballpark 2005 maybe.
Yeah, so.
He's very well loved even by like Eastern Orthodox
Yeah.
who think that the Orientals are absolutely heretics. Like they still love Matthew the Poor.
Yeah.
Like it's
Cool.
so maybe he'll
His
be a
two
bridge.
books, Communion of Love, and the other one is what?
It's the Orthodox Prayer Life, I think.
Yeah, or On Prayer or something like that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. The stuff on prayer is really good. I mean, he was a pharmacist, right?
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
basically all Coptics are. And then, it's just, no, it's so funny. The pharmacist that comes to, like, half of our Coptics, like, you know, there's a Coptic family that comes here, they're both pharmacists. It's just, like, I don't know what it is. But he gave all that up and went and restarted the Macarian monastery, right? Just went off in the desert and just started the monastery back up. Yeah, he's just, yeah, he's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, in Egypt in the 50s and the 60s, to be a pharmacist was a